what that really did was afford a sort of level of freedom that blows away even that initial sense of freedom that I tried to describe. That all-encompassing allness, and it goes by other words we might try, like wholeness or oneness. And I I can grasp, as many people have asked me about it in these terms, that that might sound terrifying to many. Like, let me get this straight. Your individuated sense of a personal self was dissolving. That sounds terrifying. And if we accomplish anything today, I would seek to gently set that fear aside for whoever is asking that kind of question. And it's because if one is dissolving into that overwhelming allness, then that overwhelming allness is entirely whole. It's all. That's how it could be all. And it's in that sense, then, if it's completely whole and completely all, then it is missing nothing. It could not possibly be missing anything. And that's why it's impossible to experience it with any sense of loss. There cannot be any sense of loss in what is absolutely overwhelmingly whole and all. And if there cannot be any sense of loss at all, then there cannot really be any sense of lack or want or need. And if there are none of those things, if there is no sense of lack or want or need, then it's essentially impossible for there to be fear.
My guest today is Jonathan Van Valin, who had a near-death experience as a result of a surgical procedure that went wrong after he left the surgical procedure. And he had this near-death experience over a course of what would be the equivalent of 2 Earth days. So there's a lot of detail here, and I'm really excited to dive deep and learn all about it. So Jonathan, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here. Thank
I'm
you.
so glad. This is going to be a fun conversation based on our pre-conversation that we've had
Yeah,
today. So why don't you begin by telling everybody a little bit about what your life was like before this happened to you?
sure. My life was tremendously ordinary, is what it was. I was 20 something, trying to figure out how to make my way in the world. I was working an office job at a tech company in Seattle, as so many young 20 somethings are doing in Seattle. Uh, I had no background in any way that would suggest much of a spiritual bent, even though I had always felt something like that in my heart. But there was no, I didn't have a particularly religious upbringing. If you had said anything to me about spiritually related things, I would have barely paid attention. And it's among the reasons that this event ended up becoming a really significant signpost in my own journey, because it turned my life in a very different direction.
That makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
So why don't you share your NDE in any way that you would like to?
Sure. All right. The setting is this. I had a surgery that's rarely done these days. It was for an issue that's a little unusual for a healthy 20 something young man. I was 29 years old. It was for sleep apnea. And it was a fairly severe case of that. And it was just a sort of a genetic quirk of the shape of my own throat and all these passages. And so surgeons chopped out as much of it as they could. And that included taking a few chips of bone out of the skull behind my nose and removing all this tissue in the back of my throat, like your tonsils and adenoidal tissue and uvula and the soft palate and all these, as much as they can. They want to take it out, so make these spaces bigger. And for those who don't know, sleep apnea is an issue where your breathing is obstructed when you sleep, and so you end up essentially stopping breathing repeatedly. And I was doing that 60, 40 to 60 times an hour, so constantly. And it's what I didn't understand as a young man was, well, I didn't know I had sleep apnea at all, because I'm sort of half asleep and unaware, and it left me feeling essentially kind of exhausted all the time, and just feeling like, wow, life is harder than I thought. Life is hard. Uh, and that's true. And you're sort of in a constant state of mild to severe sleep deprivation. And so this is eventually figured out. I go through the surgery because it's deemed really the best solution for me, even though, again, it's rarely done these days. And one of the things that they have to watch out for is that they want to take as much of that tissue out as possible. But they know if they take too much, then everything you drink for the rest of your life is going to come squirting out your nose. But there's one other possible downside, and that is that it's well known to be an extraordinarily painful recovery. And you'll see why that's a meaningful detail. But this is an extremely nerve rich part of your body, and you have to continue to use it to swallow and to breathe and things like that. And so the analogy given me at the time to prepare me for the experience was that I was going to know what it was like to break my femur and then have to walk on it for days. And that is very apt. So I've been in the hospital for 4 days. They somewhat unceremoniously kicked me out of the hospital into the care of my father. I don't have a perfect relationship with my father at the time, but it's good enough, and it was a very loving act on his part. He wanted to watch over me as I recovered, and so he took me out to the family house, which is out in 2 hours east of Seattle in some farmland, and watched over me. There's very little he could do at all. He was sort of banging around the house all the time, doing chores and doing farm things, and looking in on me and making sure that I was still, staring out a window. That was about all he could do, really. And about 3 or 4 days into his care, something uh, very different began to take place. And it began with the simple experience of what I would describe as an inner click. It was a strikingly clear moment in which there was this click inwardly. That's the best way I can describe it. And in that instant, it was immediately clear that the life force animating this was beginning to drain away, and the body was beginning to shut down. It's beginning to die. And in that same instant, there were three sort of revelations that flooded in accordance with that click. I can only describe them sequentially, but they were really quite simultaneous. The very first of those revelations was the strikingly clear awareness that the body was dying, but that there was something else persisting that was not dying. That there was an aware consciousness that was not dying. And it was in that way that in that instant, what I was able to be aware of was that I was not my body. The body was dying, and somehow I was not. In fact, that aware observer that persisted could observe that body beginning to die with, again, perfect clarity, and with enough clarity to recognize that it itself was unchanged. It wasn't dying. And that was powerful in that moment, because one of the things that meant was that in that instant, I was freed from the suffering of that body. And that body had been undergoing absolutely mind-bending, blackout level pain for days and days and days. And so to recognize that I wasn't that body was a complete release from the suffering of it. And it's something I've always wanted to be kind of subtle and clear about, because it didn't mean that the pain stopped. It didn't. The pain in that body was as present as ever. Um, it's just that I could see with perfect clarity that I didn't need to claim it. It need not be deemed mine. It was in that body. But if I was not that body, then I didn't need to be attached to that pain. I didn't need to tell a story about it. It wasn't me. It wasn't mine. I didn't have to claim it as mine. And it's the first, and by no means was it the last. And I hope we have a chance to get to some other stories in which I can kind of expand on that. But it was the first time that I saw the difference between pain and suffering. One of them was still very present, and one of them was no longer relevant at all. And so if you've been, doing the equivalent of walking on a broken leg for days, and all of a sudden you're released from that, it is an extraordinary moment of freedom. So that's the first thing that sort of flooded in the moment of that click. The second thing that flooded in was the simple awareness that this was draining away. And it was like that life force in the body was draining away, almost like watching mercury recede in a thermometer. And it was going rather slowly. And it was very clear that there was going to be time and that I was going to have time to sort of revel in this and watch it proceed. And I didn't know how long that would be, but it certainly appeared as though it would be a few days at least. And one of the things that was powerful about that was not that it was going slow. It was the fact that I could see that I was going to be able to watch it for a few days, and that came as a blessing in the sense that there was something already extraordinary about it. What I mean to communicate in it is that it wasn't a moment of panic. The release and the freedom of being freed from that suffering and seeing that there was something already very, very whole that was not my body, that was still perfectly intact, is such a revelation. It was like being gifted this, like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to get to experience this for a little while at least. So it wasn't a moment of panic. It wasn't a moment of turmoil. It wasn't a moment like, oh my God, I'm dying. I only have 2 days to fix this. It was the opposite of that. It was, I'm dying. This is extraordinary. I have at least a couple of days to squeeze this for all the juice that it's worth. And it's one of those things that no one could have tried to articulate that to me before that event. If they said, well, you're going to see what it's like to be dying. And if someone said immediately following, you're going to experience it as a gift and that you're going to want to revel in it, I couldn't have understood it. That wouldn't have made sense. But in the direct experience of it, it was literally the only reasonable response. And then the third thing sort of floods in as well. And again, this is all really, it's hard to, it's all sort of simultaneous. But that third sort of recognition and revelation that floods in is, it blows the first two away. But I have to go back to the first one, in which I've seen in that first instance that I am not my body, that there is this aware presence, there is aware being, consciousness that is not dying. But it's sort of like that aware consciousness is still being experienced as a separate thing, like a separate self, like an observer self. And in that sense, it's a very individuated thing. It just doesn't have a body. It's a non-corporeal, yet individuated sense of self. Terribly freeing. But in the third revelation, it was seen that even that non-corporeal sense of self was itself dissolving. It was fading away. As every molecule of life force left, that individuated non-corporeal sense of self felt as though it was dissolving. And it was dissolving into what's difficult to describe, but into the absolutely overwhelming allness. It was, yes, it can be quite difficult to describe. We're going to do it anyway, so let's give it our best shot today. But what that really did was afford a sort of level of freedom that blows away even that initial sense of freedom that I tried to describe. That all-encompassing allness, and it goes by other words we might try, like wholeness or oneness. And I can grasp, as many people have asked me about it in these terms, that might sound terrifying to many. Like, let me get this straight. Your individuated sense of a personal self was dissolving. That sounds terrifying. And if we accomplish anything today, I would seek to gently set that fear aside for whoever is asking that kind of question. And it's because if one is dissolving into that overwhelming allness, then that overwhelming allness is entirely whole. It's all. That's how it could be all. And it's in that sense, then, if it's completely whole and completely all, then it is missing nothing. It could not possibly be missing anything. And that's why it's impossible to experience it with any sense of loss. There cannot be any sense of loss in what is absolutely overwhelmingly whole and all. And if there cannot be any sense of loss at all, then there cannot really be any sense of lack or want or need. And if there are none of those things, if there's no sense of lack or want or need, then it's essentially impossible for there to be fear. And so there was not fear. There couldn't possibly be. And I'm sure many who might listen to this have heard the idea that fear is the opposite of love. Love is the opposite of fear. One could debate the point, but that um, if there's no sense of fear at all, then the sort of natural default setting is something very, very peaceful. And when something is that peaceful and there's no sense of lack, want, or need of any kind, then it's extraordinarily natural for that to also feel kind, gentle, essentially loving. And so I just have to emphasize again, there could not be any sense of loss at all, nor were there any questions that would actually imply that there was some kind of a lack that needed to be filled. Um, and it was in that state of mind or state of awareness that I spent the rest of the next few days. And when my father came back into the room later that day, um, and you know, again, there wasn't really much he could do on a practical level. He would come in and look and see if I was okay, and at this point, I was more than okay. Was I better? Was my body healed? No, none of that. Was that body in absolutely blackout, mind bending levels of physical pain? Yes. But even that level of distress had no power whatsoever to disturb this particular piece. And so, and again, it's a combination of all these factors I've tried to articulate. If I wasn't that body, then I'm not the suffering in that body. In fact, if I'm that body in this world, there's really nothing in this whole world that can disturb that peace. Not even the death of my own body or that body. Neither death nor pain could disturb that peace. So when he came in the room, what did I do? Nothing. I smiled at him and said nothing. There was no impulse whatsoever to say, "Hey, Dad, I'm dying." That presented itself as an utterly irrelevant factoid. I had already, in the moment that he arrives, seen that the passing away of my body was an irrelevant event. It had no particular emotional attachment, because again, that would have had to have been seen as a loss to believe that that was so, and that was impossible to see it that way in this moment. And so I smiled at him. I felt loving towards him, and he just looked back at me and clearly thought, "It looks like he's okay." And he turned around and went on about his way. went and did some chores. And that's kind of how it went all afternoon. And that night, uh, I thought, wow, I may actually sleep. If you're in really severe pain, it's next to impossible to sleep. So I had not slept well or hardly at all for days. And I thought maybe I'll actually sleep. That sounds amazing. And that's exactly what had happened, or that is exactly what happened. So I did sleep, and but I would still wake up throughout the night, and every time I'd wake up, I'd think, "Am I still dying? Yes. Is that life force draining away? Yes. In fact, it's draining away a little faster now." And again, as every molecule of life force left, that merging with the infinite increased in the same. And it was as exquisite then as it was before. And when I woke up in the morning, I could see that the mercury had dropped quite a bit, that that runway was getting shorter, but there was still some time. Um, and during that next morning, and again, the state of mind, the state of awareness that I'm describing was essentially that's all there was. Um, it had not wavered. In fact, it had simply deepened because that merging with the infinite had been increasing the whole time. And a curious thought arose in my mind, and it was the recognition that there was going to be a time when that runway ran out and that life force, was gone, all the way gone. And I was getting to that point where, as we often say in these forums, that I was about to be crossing over to the other side, or that moment was coming much sooner now. But what arose was the clear awareness that I actually had a choice in that. And I could choose to go through that doorway. And to do so would be the easiest thing you could ever imagine. It would be easier than falling off a log. It would be merely a choice. There was nothing in it that would require effort, sacrifice. It had nothing to do with merit. It had nothing to do with, you know, did I learn my lessons? Irrelevant. All of it, irrelevant. It was merely a choice. Um, and what also arose really surprised me was a thought like, that doorway is coming much sooner now. That choice point, I will have to make that choice much sooner. But when I do, I think I may not go through that door. And that surprised me. Like if someone were to ask a question like, well, why wouldn't you go towards the greatest peace you've ever known? Why wouldn't you go towards the cessation of any kind of limitations? And why would one not want to go towards the dropping any kind of suffering whatsoever, and being enveloped in the peace that passes understanding? Why wouldn't you go towards that? It's a very reasonable question. Um, and There's certainly nothing wrong with going towards that. And that's how it presented. There's nothing wrong with going towards that. Valid choice. And so it was still surprising me that there was something in my mind that said, yeah, I think I'm not going to do it anyway. I think there's things that I need to do here. And I think I'm going to stick around to do them. But here's again what was surprising about that was I had no idea what that meant. I was a 29-year-old, uh, young man trying to figure out life otherwise outside of all of this. Did I have any real sense of purpose? No. Did I have any real sense of where I was going in my young life? Not really. Not really. Um, so if I was to, you know, if there were things I was supposed to do here, the next thought was, well, I don't know what they are, but I guess I'm going to have to figure out what they are. Maybe not too surprisingly. A little while after that thought had gone through my head that I think maybe I'll stay. There's some things I got to do here, even though I don't know what they are. I'll have to figure it out. Soon thereafter, my father comes in the room, and this time everything changes. His face changes. He looks at me and he squinches his face up and he says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. And I think we're going to load up the car and we're going to head back over to the hospital. And if it hadn't been for moments earlier in which I thought, I think I'm going to stay, I don't think hearing him say that would have made any real sense. But because that is how it went, I was like, ah, all right, we'll go. We'll go back to the hospital. I mean, I guess I'll stay. Sure. I'm not going through the door. We'll go back to the hospital. You know, fine. All right, we'll do it. I was not in a hurry. I was not, everything was fine. I was in an incredibly good mood. Like it's hard to explain. I could barely speak. I mean, my throat has been chopped up. It's healing. I can barely eke out a whispered word. But it's a 2 hour drive. We go back to the same hospital that conducted the surgery in the first place. We're going to go to the ER at that hospital. And during the ride, I'm quietly trying to whisper out jokes to get my dad to laugh. I don't know why. It just seemed fun. And I could barely do it. When we got to the ER, I asked the receptionist if we could order a pizza, which for the record, I couldn't have eaten anyways. It just seemed like a fun thing to say for an ER waiting room. And it was very quickly my turn at the ER, and the docs there both pronounced correctly to my father that I was in fact dying, but also I was dying for the dumbest reason in all of medical science. I am dying for the dumbest reason. My body is shutting down and dying from dehydration. Uh, which is also a really easy fix. And so the ER docs poke an IV bag into my arm with a saline solution, and instantly when they connect that saline, that life force feels as though it begins to flow back in, and that merging with the infinite now begins to reverse. And I'm beginning to put my feet a bit more back on the ground here. They watch and observe for a few hours to make sure I'm not going to keel over and everything's fine, which it is. We get back in the car and drive another 2 hours back to the house. And from that point forward, my recovery from this whole thing speeds up four or fivefold. It turns out that being extremely dehydrated makes it very difficult for your body to heal. And it also it tends to make pain in the body exacerbated. So pain levels came down, rate of healing goes up, everything works better. Uh, I do have some pretty significant healing to do, so I'm actually at the farmhouse there for another 3 solid weeks. But at the end of that 3 weeks, I go back to my own apartment and I go back to my job, and uh, and I bury this experience to the greatest degree that I can. And it's because despite having seen what I've seen and known what I know and experienced what I experienced and all of that, which I cannot forget, but as I'm driving to work a little bit late and trying not to spill the cup of takeout coffee and eating, half eating a breakfast burrito in the car while I'm sitting in traffic, or and getting to the office, and I find it so difficult to reconcile what I'd experienced with how ordinary life seems to play out, see how it seems to work. Because in this ordinary life, I felt as if my body was extremely important, that it was me, that everything associated to it was extremely important, that it has a very finite existence. And, we could go on and on. We all know what it's like to live human life here. And it seems in many ways upside down and backwards from what I knew was true. And I could not reconcile it. But what it did, and so I couldn't figure out how to speak about it. I never um, tried to articulate to my father. Never once did I say, "Dad, I'm dying." And also, it doesn't matter. I'm fine. In fact, I'm better than ever. Never once did I try to look him in the eye and say, "Well, the thing is, this I know what it looks like, but this isn't me. I'm not. This isn't me. It doesn't matter. Nor is it you. That sack of bones you're carrying around." There's no way I could look my father in the eye and say those things in a way that would have had any meaning or make any sense to him, and I knew that. And I couldn't figure out how to articulate that to anyone else either. And so my default setting was simply that I wouldn't say anything to anyone ever.
Here we are.
Yeah, here we are. Things have changed. Things have changed over time, and that's why I hope we get to have more of a conversation in a sense, because um, what this experience did for me was turn me inward in a way that took quite a few years to sort of marinate, and it essentially turned me into a bit of a spiritual seeker in a way that I don't know that any other experience could have. And I think, in my own journey, in my own story, that may be its greatest purpose. Like, it turned me in a direction and to reconcile. It's like, how does this make sense? How can I make sense out of this? How can I live this life and know that and make any sense about bringing how do those things come together? And it basically took the next a little over, well, it took a bunch of years and a whole bunch of additional experiences to really begin to reconcile that. And there came a couple of really powerful experiences that I had no idea were coming, that to me were bigger, more powerful shifts in my own journey than this NDE was.
Wow. Well, I definitely want to cover those. But before we go in that direction, can I ask you
Yes,
questions about the NDE?
yes, yes, please.
I'm curious, who was the first person you did tell and when?
Um, um, it took an absurdly long time. What I would do is I would tell the story, but leave out the juicy parts. Like, because people all ask, they're like, they're like, oh, I was away from work for 3 weeks. They're like, hey, how'd it go? I mean, I guess the surgery turned out okay. Did it work? Is the sleep apnea fixed? Can you sleep now? And I'd say, oh yeah, 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 yeah. It went great. Nearly died. But it worked out great. Yeah, I got to see what it's like to have a good night's sleep for the first time in my life. It's amazing. I got to say, this is really worth it. Um, but I didn't say anything about merging into the infinite, or that myself and my body were two distinctly different things, one of which was irrelevant. And that in the end, even that individuated sense of self was clearly a fiction. At no point did I look someone in the eye and say, oh, that sense of self you carry around in there, that's a complete fiction, you made it up. um like that One of the things I've learned a great deal about um, is learning, I hope, to speak in the languages that people. Excuse me. All of a sudden, I got a little verklempt. uh, is to is that we have to speak in the language that someone can hear. We have to speak in the language that someone can listen, in a way
Yeah.
that's meaningful for them, relevant for them, and to look someone in the eye and say, you don't really exist in the way that you
Most people
think.
can't handle that truth.
It's not even useful. It's not
No,
helpful. It
no.
simply isn't. It's just not meaningful to them. Maybe sometime in the future, um, perhaps. And sometimes planting a seed like that, as outrageous as it sounds, sometimes it's a seed planted that sprouts later.
Yeah,
Um,
you said something that really, really hit me when you were talking about your third thought that came in about the individual consciousness dissolving into the collective consciousness. And then like, why would somebody want to do that? I very, very distinctly remember when I became aware that that was something that I felt we did on a soul level. And I
mhm,
do also remember thinking, why in the world would we want to do that?
mhm.
But then as you go along your journey, you understand more and more. And then you realize at some point that those thoughts weren't even real anyway, because it was always we were one and we just individuated ourselves. And that was the pony
Yes,
trick, not the opposite direction.
yes. Well said. Yes, beautifully, beautifully, beautifully said. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, why would one go that way? Oh, well, it's actually that we've been going the opposite direction the whole time.
Exactly.
And these kinds of stories are just ways of looking over our shoulder going, oh, wait, I think I'm remembering a little bit where I came from in the first place.
Yeah.
Um, and it's one of the reasons it's possible to look in the eye of absolutely any other person, including the ones that might find losing their sense of self terrifying. Um, it's possible to look right in their eye and know that that is where they have been and are always and have been eternally. And that even though they may be experiencing something that's fearful right now, that there's a level on which that simply isn't true, and there will come a time in which they get to experience something of that directly. Right now may not be that moment, but nobody gets to avoid the truth forever,
Yeah. That's
from
like
my
what
point of
I say
view.
in the comments, people will push back on some things that have been said in an interview,
Mhm.
concepts that may be foreign to them. And I say, take in what resonates, leave
Yeah,
behind what doesn't. It might not be for you right now. It might
yeah.
never be for you, but you never know when you'll come back to something and it will make
Hmm.
sense.
If I may, I might just address a little something that is a real corollary to what you just shared yourself.
Please, yes.
Um, I've often been asked, when I'm just sort of describing how this experience began to unfold, they say, "Oh, so you were having an out of body experience then?" And I like to be, if I can, a little bit subtle about it in the sense that when in the coming years, as I said, there were a whole bunch of other experiences coming my way.
Which I definitely want to get
Yeah,
to for sure.
yeah, anytime. We'll get to it eventually, but that included some experiences of being very classically sort of out of body experiences, the way people have often described them. And I don't think out of body experiences are particularly unusual or rare or anything like that. I think they're relatively common. Um, but there's a way that we often think about them. People often think about them in a way that sort of accords this equal amount of reality. Like there's my body, and that's a very real thing, and then there's my soul or myself, or this, that's a very real thing. And they usually seem like this, but in this instance, the awareness was over here, the body was over there. It got to observe the body, and they're both sort of related, very real aspects of reality. And what was partly at the heart of my own experience was not quite that. It was, as I said, like I can see that I'm not my body. This body isn't me. But it wasn't because I was over here on the wall or on the ceiling observing that body. It was because there was the felt experiential sense that that physical body had an illusory quality to it, an illusory quality to it. That it was that that experience that is sort of the normal frame of reference in which I feel like I'm, kind of looking out here and like kind of contained in here, and this is mine, and then I'm sort of in there. That is what had that was kind of an elaborate illusion.
Like the veil, that's what they speak about when they say that we've put this veil on
Yeah,
that keeps us from remembering that we are all.
right. Which is a point I'm going to come back to in a second way too in a moment. But it the core of that experience was that that body is as its illusory quality, and if something is in fact an illusion, it doesn't have real reality. It's a figment. It doesn't really have the power to contain anything. It's a figment. It's a mirage. And so it wasn't that I was having an experience of being separate, like over here and observing over there. I was observing out of the usual oculus. It's just that there was experience that this had this illusory quality to it. And in that sense, then, not only did it not contain me, it had never contained me. It was an illusion. An illusion can't really do anything. It isn't anything. It's the appearance of something without any fundamental truth to it. And so, as an illusion, I had never really been contained by it. It just had the illusory appearance of seeming that way briefly.
Well, at the point that you realize that, how did that change how you then proceeded with this illusionary experience you're
Yeah.
having, because that's a tough one to
Yeah.
integrate, Jonathan.
I agree. I mean, I think it's why I didn't really, it's why, again, when you're rushing to work late with a breakfast burrito in your hand, you're like,
Right.
wait, what? Here I am, like, I'm feeding it, I'm trying to take care of it. It seems really important. When I stub my toe, I don't like it at all. Uh, and this thing is kind of expensive too. And it takes a lot of, you know, it takes all the real world things that we're used to dealing with. And um, I mean, you're asking the best possible questions. Um, there's a part of in the midst of those couple of days, um, there was really nothing being asked of me. I literally had nothing to do other than sit up straight and stare out a window, and I didn't really even have to do that much. You know, there was no, and so all I was doing was sort of reveling in this awareness, and that's it. There were no other requirements. Um, and again, when that aperture sort of, when that life force began to flow back in, that sailing bag is connected, like it's all, all this awareness is sort of beginning to reverse. And it's part of why it was possible to bury it. It was almost like, I know I can't forget. Like if you've had a really powerful dream at night and you wake up, and we easily forget most of our dreams, but there's probably a few in most people's life that are like, yeah, I've always remembered that one that stuck with me forever. um, and yet it's still, there's parts of it that you've forgotten. It's not as vivid as it once was. It didn't quite carry the same emotional power that it had in the moment that you awoke. And it's kind of easy to forget about it. And that really is a pretty good metaphor for how I kind of slipped right back into the regular stream of life. And yet there's this part of it that's just, I can't entirely forget. And again, it's why I think it took a bunch of years and a bunch of additional experiences to begin to kind of unpack all of that and unwrap all of that. And I'm not, to this day, I am not a fan of hitting my thumb with a hammer. uh, Not a fan. Wouldn't suggest it to anyone. However, there have been other times, and we'll talk about at least one of them, in which I've ended up, meeting some really massive physical pain and gotten to remember the difference between pain and suffering, and not suffered it.
Well, I think that that's a really good thing. It's a great place to just elaborate a little bit here, because I'm sure people watching right now
Mm-hmm.
either are in some kind of pain themselves,
Yeah.
physical, emotional, doesn't matter what it is, or
Yeah.
they maybe live with somebody or are close to
Mm-hmm.
somebody that they want to help in some way.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to somebody
Mm-hmm.
watching who is in a lot of pain?
Yeah. Um, that's that's where that faculty of speaking in the language that they can hear makes that's where that rubber really meets the road. And um, in a very related topic, you know, the way I'm going to meet that is I'm going to listen as carefully as I can to the inner prompt, to the inner guidance, um, and follow its dictates to the greatest degree that I can. And one of the ways I could describe my entire spiritual journey in a very summary sort of way is it's been a journey from um, kind of listening to that inner guidance to increasingly more and more and more and more and more listening. Um, so do I have a handy 3-step process to hand out to how to meet the people in your life that are really in a lot of pain? Um, Not in the way that is usually depicted in our self-help world. Um, I know what underlies it, which is something that is not judging and very loving. And those are basically the same thing. Um, and what form that takes with this person or that person is going to be a little different every single time. I do end up meeting with a lot of people, and some of them are in pain, and some of them come to me specifically because of that. And what happens um, more often than not is we start out with a few moments of pure silence together, and um, and it's there's something about that that seems to help in terms of sharing with them something that you and I talked about earlier, which is something about that light and lovingness that I think you said in your words, you said, well, it's the light and lovingness that comes from the other side.
Yeah.
It comes from source. Um, and um, and for me, in those moments of silence or quietude, that um, it's a way of sharing that, and that shows up for this person, the one that's in pain, maybe, and it's going to show up in some way that is meaningful to them, or acceptable to them, or accessible to them. That's very different for every single person. There are literally people in our world for whom, if you took away their pain, it would actually up their fear. And that can
Hmm.
sound crazy, but I've certainly seen it, and it's not to suggest that anyone should remain in pain. It is not that at all. But um, uh, if someone's in pain, the first thing I'm going to do is um, ask if it's okay to probably ask if it's okay to touch them, whether that means putting a hand on top of their hand, or a hand on top of their shoulder, or giving them a hug, you know, um, and and in and just return to that love for a minute. Um, we could make it more complicated, but that's really
Fair enough.
what's at the core.
So you have had a couple of other really spiritually transformative experiences. Would
Hmm.
you like to share one or two of those with us as well?
Sure. I mean, since we're on the topic um, of pain, and so I'm definitely going to gloss over the the really specific details. They're not that important, but uh, 6 or 7 years after this NDE, I end up in a situation in which, again, and I'm surprised by it at the time, but uh, I end up in a situation where I'm in really, really massive pain, physical pain, which I was not expecting. Uh, uh, and I end up going through another unexpected process that um, basically a day and a half of just trying to tough it out, like real dude sort of way, like, all right, I can handle it. I'm gonna handle it. Like I'm gonna be tough, and it broke me down so hard. And after a day and a half of this sort of contending with it, the first thing that took place for me was uh, a sort of life review experience that was horrifying, because it was like experiencing there was something about the physical pain and resisting it that just cracked something open inside of me. And all of a sudden, spontaneously, I had the experience of all the pain I've ever experienced, emotionally or physically, come flooding through me all at once in this sort of life review kind of way, all at the same time. And it is an overwhelm of pain that is so massive that I just lose it. I mean, I just end up in like spasmodic shrieking, bawling, and it's I'm a total wreck. And and then that that goes on for a little while, and then it morphs to what sort of feels like in a deeper way. So instead of experiencing my own collective pain, emotionally and physically, all at once, that sort of cracks open wider. And all of a sudden, I have the experience that I'm actually feeling the collective pain of all the souls, of 8 billion, of all of humanity. And that is a level of overwhelm that I absolutely cannot even begin to put into words. It is a level of overwhelm I cannot put into words. Um, and it is, it, I mean, it it just devastates.
Are you in your body when this happens, or are you out of body when this happens?
It's an interesting question. Like, how can you experience that somehow contained just in your own body? And I don't know how to even articulate it. It was, um, perhaps because of the fact that there was a part of my mind that's already cracked open to the idea that I'm not, so limited by this body. I think that's probably one of the reasons something like this could come along. But um, one of the things that's shown is that not only is the collective suffering of mankind just utterly massive, but that it's not, in a way, it's there, like my own personal suffering and the suffering of mankind are a corollary to each other. It's one of the ways, that we can say we're all far more alike than we are different. Like suffering, and there's a million different forms, but suffering is suffering. And it for the moment, it just results in this total overwhelm. Eventually, as an internal experience, and I'm like, I'm on a floor. I can't even. I'm having a hard time finding words even now. But there comes a point when it kind of finally, the aperture kind of kind of closes back down, and I'm left in a heap of sweat and tears, and it looks like I've had like an epileptic seizure, probably from the outside, and I'm left on the floor in a heap of sort of PTSD level shell shock. Um, and I eventually kind of get up and stumble out and go walk around outside for a while. And I think I can't imagine how to. I can't handle anything more. I can't do. What more could there be? Um, and the following day, um, I'm still ruminating on it, of course, and I'm sort of searching for, like, I don't know what to do with this. And that following day, another experience opens up, which is remarkably similar to some of the aspects of that NDE, in which, first of all, I'm put back in touch very intimately with that experience that I'm truly, truly, I am not this body, that all of that suffering that's in the body and therefore in the world in general, in this dimension, uh, is, you know, it happens to these bodies, but there's an aspect of awareness. There's an aspect of consciousness that is outside the limitation of that, beyond the limitation of that. And I feel that sense of I feel a sense of self literally blow up to fill the room that I'm in. It's kind of another way of having an out of body experience, which my literal sense of self fills the room, then it feels like it goes beyond the room, then it kind of feels like it is literally everywhere. And if you're everywhere, then there's nowhere that you aren't, and it's a very difficult thing to put into words and whatever. And it put me so back in touch with some of these other experiences, and then even that, it was sort of like the divine saying, Jonathan, here's the problem: pain and suffering. Here you go, individually, collectively. Here's the entire scope of the problem. And that next day was sort of like saying, here's the other side. here's here's some of the truth of your real being, and you can see how different they are. And it's sort of almost being like saying, well, here's the solution. With that awareness, with that kind of awareness, no matter what comes, you you don't have to suffer. um, and that's still mind bending. Like, okay, how do I connect the dots on these things? Um, and yet the next day, there was yet another day and I'm like ruminating on it. And what comes up the following day was, here's how you connect the dots. I mean, I'm just going to say it. It sounds outrageous, but here's one way of encapsulating the solution to the suffering of mankind. Three little words. And those words were, give up judgment.
Mm.
that's how you connect the dots on these experiences. That's how it's one way of encapsulating how one goes from experiencing that in suffering and setting down the frame of reference in which that suffering is inevitable in favor of a wider frame of reference in which the suffering is somewhere between optional and irrelevant.
Mm.
Um, the reason, and it then took me again, it took many years, frankly, of chewing on those three words to begin to feel as though I could, more fully understand what they really meant.
So
Um,
how did you integrate that or implement that in your life with the judging once you heard that and you knew that to be really important?
um, by sort of, I can't really claim that I had like some really conscious practice on it, but it rolled around in my mind all the time. And there was a way in which I could see during this particular bunch of years that my own tendency to judge did grow much softer. Um, and um, and sometimes that was somehow more natural, and sometimes there were other ways in which old patterns that I've been in where I'm really holding on to some judgment, um, and I was still holding on to it. But there was a, one of the most powerful tools that we learn with is contrast. And when and that's one of the ways we could say this was meaningful to me. Like, here's suffering, here's the solution. When you see these extremes on either side, then it's like, oh, it becomes much clearer all of a sudden. Well, which direction do I want to go in? Do I want to go in that one? No, that one's horrifying. What about this one? Well, I don't know that I fully understand it, but it clearly is the only direction to go in. So like my entire being sort of felt like it was like, hey, wait a minute. Let's every molecule in me was like, oh, hey, what about maybe more that way? And that would come up in small daily ways all the time because we're faced with all kinds of small daily things all the time, in which I had an opportunity to fall back into an old pattern, but there was a little bit of mindfulness that was like, wait a minute, I don't necessarily have to do this the old way. And sometimes it just sort of felt like it had a life of its own, like my own proclivity to judge just was softened and was already softening. And by that experience, usually when I would look back on something, I would think, oh, I that would have been really harsh before, but I didn't experience it. Oh, that was nice. How nice. Um, it's like when someone begins to grasp that being angry is actually a really ugly experience for them, for themselves, and they go, oh, I don't really like, I don't really. That's not a great experience for me. Uh, hmm. What
Mm.
can I, and like all of a sudden, all kinds of ways, consciously and unconsciously, they're starting to sort of redirect themselves into a different frame of reference. And so it was a lot like that over many, many years, really. Uh, um, it actually goes back to something that you alluded to when you asked me a previous question about um, about how a soul looks at things, or how a soul is outside of a body or something like that. And this may sound like a bit of a leap, but um, the reason that if three little words like give up judgment could have meaning to me were that they began to show me how the faculty of judgment is such a powerful force in the way we create separation in our minds. And when I judge something, I'm creating a set of dualities essentially. And it doesn't really matter what kind of dualities, it's still some kind of a duality: good, bad, right, wrong, who's on top, who's not, what you should have done versus what you did do. It's endless. Um, and um, and that's really at the heart of suffering as well.
That's
Um,
very profound. Like, let that sink in. When you're judging something, you're creating more separateness. You're becoming more
yeah.
individuated, which then increases the suffering. It's all
Hmm.
tied together. So it's
Yes.
interesting that that tenet of what you do to another, you literally do to yourself,
Hmm.
is by judging, you just created a larger chasm between
Hmm.
you and the other, which
Hmm.
made you more separate, which made you further away from the love. Like the whole thing is tied in. I haven't heard anybody explain it quite like this, and it just feels a little bit like an aha moment.
I can appreciate that very, very much. That's how it felt to me when that thought first occurred. And I feel, compelled to just point out in my own fallible human way, it took years for me to unpack what it really meant.
I can imagine.
Mhm.
So, did you come back with abilities that you didn't have before?
Not yet. They were coming.
They were coming. So, can you tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about some of the ones that have shown up now?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, there are a couple of other powerful shifts in there for me. Maybe we'll get back to those another time. But uh, there was a particular juncture where things really, really shifted. And to me, it's the most pivotal point in my entire journey. Um, and it, subsequent to that shift, it was clear to me that I was never going to look at the world in the same way again, that I was never going to move through it in the same way again. Uh, and that I was absolutely leaving sort of my former life behind permanently. And that has held true. Um, so the the things that arose, as per your question, uh, there was a way in which the sort of intuitive doorway kind of opened up in me in a way I absolutely didn't anticipate. Um, and I don't know, I'm not sure this is typical for a lot of people who go through these kind of doorways. First of all, those kinds of experiences, as abilities, as we often call them, do often open up. There's actually nothing, again, particularly unusual about that. It seems like a common part of the journey when people go through these kinds of doorways. The way I like to think about it is that those, sort of quote unquote abilities are really something more about the way I like to think of them is that their their channels for communication have simply widened, and so there's those channels are wider so that there's more access to more information, but also more flow in the opposite direction as well, in a way, and that's a completely natural evolution. Um, for me, it meant that there was some ways in which just intuitive abilities kind of went up, and I did go through a mind bending week where I was seeing uh, things like past life information and current life information and just insight into people's inner experiences in a way that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before and had no um, I had no prior experience to lean on. It was just a bit mind bending. Interestingly to me, that took place for uh, about a week and a half, and then that aperture closed partially back down. And so these days, I sort of often feel as though I have um, a bit of a higher intuitive window into people's experiences, minds, sometimes in their states of mind and in general ways. Um, but I don't feel like I've met. gifted psychics and, people that make their living being intuitive. And I don't feel like that's where I'm living in the way that some other people do. Another thing did arise though, which was there was a period where I started to get this inner prompt of being useful to people, and that I could be useful to people by, and it still strikes me as weird, and I'm a little uncomfortable about it. But even though I've done this now thousands of times probably, but that I could be useful to people by putting my hand on their head, which initially just made me want to barf. Like,
Well,
what?
you
I'm
you
not
mentioned
doing
that before, like
that.
you when I asked you that question about pain, you said one of the
Yeah,
things I would do is I would ask them if I could put my hand on their
yeah,
hand or my
yeah,
hand on their head or
yeah,
their shoulder or give them a
yeah,
hug. And
yeah.
so I wondered if there was something there.
Yeah. There did. There came. I'm thinking of a particular time in life when this really rather dramatic shift took place. We could call it awakening. We could use all the words for it. It doesn't really matter what we call it. I think the most benign, and it's a very accurate one. It's just a shift in awareness.
So what
Um,
happens though when you put your hand on somebody's head is do they feel something also, or do you just then connect more to them?
let me describe, and then you can tell me
Okay.
how you would think about it. So um, here's how it goes, and everything we've talked about so far is relevant to what I'm about to say. So in that moment in which I put my hand on somebody's head, all I'm doing is going inwardly to that quiet, still place in which there is no sense of an individuated self at all. That's it, and that's all. And so it's easier to describe what I am not doing. Am I
Mm.
hoping something good happens for them? No. Am I praying? No. Am I setting an intention? Am I calling on guides? Am I checking the Akashic records? Am I polishing auras? Am I moving energy? Am I doing Reiki? Am I trying to be a healer? No, I'm not doing not a single one of those things. Um, it's going, it's just, it's returning, it's revisiting, it's putting my own awareness into that frame of reference in which that individuated sense of self is simply not there at all. And to me, that has come to seem to be a very automatic and overwhelmingly natural thing, because to me, it's the fundamental truth. And so there's no effort in it in any way. I'm not applying effort to do it. It's just like, that's how it is. There's no effort in that. And so, um, and that is all. But like I tried to articulate before, if there's no sense of an individuated sense of self, then there's no one there to be a volitional force to affect a thing happening, which is why I'm not trying to do something. I'm not trying to be a healer, or be intuitive, or have a look at their past lives, or anything.
It sounds
Um,
like more like you're just connecting a dot. You're just closing the gap of the separation.
I think that's beautifully put, because the sort of internal experience of it here is that overwhelming, undifferentiated wholeness here connects with the same thing there and sees that it's identical, sees that it is one thing.
Hmm.
And if it really, and I'm not talking about two different sides of the same thing, or coming together. I'm just saying it's like what's here and what's there is one indivisible whole, always has been. And again, in that, there's no sense of lack or want or need, none.
Mm.
And in that sense, there cannot be any sense of there being something that needs to be healed, even. Um, and and it's so there isn't. I mean, the best way I can describe or explain it is as though some sense of that wholeness or allness or oneness then often seems to arise in the awareness of this other seeming person in a
Almost like a
way.
recognition, like they saw it in themselves through that
Yeah,
experience, that connection.
yeah, it arises in them in some way that is accessible to them, is understandable to them, is meaningful to them. And that takes a million different forms. And it has more to do with their own level of openness and awareness than it has anything to do with me.
Hmm. Just like what we
Um,
were talking about before the interview.
yes, exactly.
You got to it.
Uh, yeah. And so sometimes they describe that as a very healing experience.
Hmm.
They often describe it in very energetic terms, like I felt all this energy, or this moved, or that moved, um, or they have a vivid internal experience that's very visual, if that's the kind of person they are, that's very meaningful to them. Or probably one of the most common things people report is they would report an inner experience of their own of a particularly prescient peace, something very gentle, very peaceful, in a way that's a little unusual for them. Um, uh, and it's all over the map. I've had people describe. I mean, I've witnessed uh, probably in 30% of the people that have come to me some kind of physical shift, um, and sometimes it's jaw dropping. I've I've rarely I don't lead with those kinds of stories ever, and part of the reason is that um, it seems very foolish to me to um, just to set up expectations, because what that really does is set up opportunities for judgment. And
Hmm.
it's like leaving that slate as clean as possible is frequently somehow the best.
And if people are still watching all the way to the end of this interview, they just picked up an incredibly important gold nugget.
God bless.
Because I think you just told us who you are, but it was almost like I had to pull it out of you.
uh, Historically, my default setting is to say nothing. That's historically how, uh,
I could get that from you. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's beautiful. Well, of course, I'm sure that there are people who are watching who want to connect with you. So, Jonathan, what's the best way to
Welcome.
do that?
Oh, the best way is to come track me down at the old website.
Okay.
And that's assistthespirit.com. And people can write me a message and they can reach out. They can work with me one on one. They can, most of the traveling I do these days is because I was invited to go somewhere to, because someone invited me to come speak to their group or something.
Nice.
Um,
Well, tell
uh,
people though about what you're planning for May of 2026.
oh, that's a great idea.
Sorry to
Uh,
anybody who's watching that's already passed since these videos live in perpetuity.
yeah. Um, yeah, I'm going to spend a bunch of the next months working on a book, but in the projection right now is May of this coming spring, May 2026, is to lead uh, probably a 7-day walk on the El Camino. In there's some, we'll see exactly what the route is, but it's probably going to be the Portuguese route, which basically is a route that goes up the beautiful Portuguese coastline and then turns inward at the last minute to arrive at the city of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And it's an age-old pilgrimage route. Thousands of people walk these routes these days, and it would essentially be essentially a walking retreat. And we get to share a lot of this uh, vibe, I suppose, for the lack of a better word. um,
Sounds amazing.
yeah, such that a little of that peace that passes all understanding can be ever more a bit found within and taken with you into the rest of the busy doings of regular life.
Yeah, beautiful. Well,
Yeah.
Jonathan, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. This is definitely one of the most unique near-death experiences that I've heard. I haven't heard of anybody having this experience for a really long time where that life force was draining and then you got to merge in all these different ways. So this is really, really interesting. I loved listening to this.
I'm so glad you did.
And I want to thank you
Boy,
for your part and what you are doing to help wake up the collective. It is so needed right now.
well, I'm with you on that, and I'm glad to be a part of it. I can't really imagine that there's anything better to be doing with my time, our time.
Nice.
And I'm glad to be here to play some part in that too. Thank
And
you
I
so much
appreciate
for the
everybody who
opportunity.
tuned in, that we got to be a part of your time, which is also so valuable. So I wanted to say thank you to everybody for watching. Next up, check out this playlist of other NDE interviews. Please like and subscribe. It really helps this channel to grow so I can bring you more content. Thank you for watching. I'm so glad you're here.